Tony, welcome to a conversation between ourselves, but hopefully one where we can reach out to Australians who I think are very worried about where their country's going. Now, you are a man who's had a long and very distinguished career in the public sector, in the private sector, as a business representative, as a respected economist and spokesman, and keen sportsman, and so on and so forth. And you could be just out enjoying yourself, but you're still very engaged in the public debate about where the country goes. Can I start by saying to you, economics shouldn't just be about nice numbers. It's really about people. Why are you concerned about where we're going?
Well, John, the Australian community, the average Australian, is worried.
Yeah.
And they have every right to be worried.
They should be worried?
They should be worried. And their instincts are right. The average Australian now feels that they can't get ahead. Post-war Australia was characterised by the next day, every day was better than the last day. Next year I was always going to do better than last year. And that was just a part of our national psyche. But we're at a situation now where a lot of Australians feel next year I'll be lucky if I hold up to where I am now. I may even slip back a bit next year. And by the way, I'm really worried about my children. You know, a lot of Australians feel that their children will not have as good a life as they've had. That is just an appalling situation in a country as rich and as innovative as we used to be, and a country that was so progressive, to have that sort of situation. And then you have to unpack, well, the causes of that, what causes this insecurity and what have you, and then, of course, the $64,000 question, what can you do about it? But I can sense this from the community, endless surveys and the various organisations I've been with, focus groups that I've sat in. This just comes out over and over again. You know, they're worried about the cost of living. They're worried about the cost of housing. They're worried about the effectiveness of our education and training system. They're worried about a lack of infrastructure. Yeah, the list is endless. They're worried about health and health funding. All of these things just compound on them. They know that the government is in a structural deficit, but they're putting that aside because all they're worried about themselves now is, you know, how do I get by? How do I look after myself? So Australians have become incredibly sort of inward turning. What's good for my family is good for me. I'm not too worried about what the rest of the country is doing, which I think is a very sad development.
It's interesting that if I were to just say, look, plainly you and I want a better outcome for the country and for our kids and our grandkids. I said to someone the other day, you know, look, we're a young country. Unlike the rest of the West, we ought to be able to say our best days are still in front of us. We're not yet, and I emphasise yet, crippled hopelessly by debt. We're young demographically, young democracy. We're in the happening part of the world. We ought to be able to say our best days are in front of us. But Australians plainly sense that perhaps we're not. And by the way, the research backs that up. The Legatum Institute in England, out of London, publishes a global prosperity index every year, which looks not just at material wealth, but how people feel. And our Indonesian neighbours to the north will tell you that they feel if they work hard and they're good citizens and have a go, life will work out well and they'll get ahead.
Yeah.
We don't.
We don't.
Which is extraordinary. We're way below New Zealanders.
We are. And I think the facts that have caused that are many and complex, but fundamentally, I think the average Australians lost faith in their political leaders. I think that is one of the core problems. And in the past, they've been prepared to take measures which might be regarded as difficult and accept them on the basis that, yeah, but tomorrow will be better. But now they're not. And I think the things that are driving that are, well, look, my electricity bill's gone up 3 times in 15 years. My transport costs are going through the roof. Houses are now so much more expensive than when I bought a house. I can't see my children continuing to live in Sydney or Melbourne because the houses are so expensive. Jobs, job security, the casualisation of the workforce, the reduction in jobs. I mean, the digital economy, artificial intelligence, robots, what have you, they're all designed for one thing, they're to get rid of jobs. And the people see that and they sense that, and that makes them worried. If you mention the word innovation in Western Sydney or Western Queensland or what have you, all they think of is, oh, I'm going to lose my job.
Absolutely.
That's not a good thing. In the past, innovation in Australia was what drove the economy. We innovative people. We didn't have a lot of people, so we had to innovate to make things work more efficiently with less people and what have you. But now it's like a negative term that turns people off, and so those things are sort of building up. Real wages haven't increased really for the last 3 years.
Seeing a hollowing out of the middle classes?
We're hollowing out the middle, and the lower classes are getting hollowed out.
And people with a lot of assets.
Yeah. And so people are actually, investing in housing and property because that's about as secure as they can get. Business, non-resources business investment is at the lowest rate of growth it's had in years. We've got record low interest rates. This should be the time that you'd borrow and invest, but they're not. Why not? Well, they're not too sure about the future either. So if business, big, small and medium, are saying we're not too sure about long-term investment, well, you can't blame the people for being a little bit cautious as well as to where is this country going. And business needs, a good policy framework which encourages investment. They need to be able to rely on the laws that exist now and not going to be changed in the future to their strong detriment and what have you. And they want sensible laws and regulations. They don't want, over-regulation by any stretch. But at the moment, business looks at it and says, well, look, the policy framework is very fluid. Now, we don't want certainty at any cost, okay? We don't want a $25 a tonne carbon tax. That's certainty for you, and we'll all go bust. But they want some reasonable assurance that they will not be facing sovereign risk in their own country.
Let's continue to unpack this, because the people we want to reach, I think we've got to say, look, the problems are serious. You're right to be worried. How do we find a way forward? And we'll come back to that. I think there are those around now suggesting that perhaps it was an aberration that we had very strong political leadership reforming governments of both colours. And I was part of the second one, and at the heart of policy making and razor gangs and all of those sorts of things when we turned all that red ink into black ink. But we had those years really off the back of some very ordinary performances, particularly in the 70s.
Yes.
The Whitlam years, stagflation, what have you. Then you had reforming governments under Hawke and Keating and the Howard Coalition era. It was tough going, taking, if you like, budget trimmings wherever we could to get things back into surplus, tackling waterfronts,
GST,
deregulation of the economy, taxation reform. Why is it, since the onset of what's known as the Great Financial Crisis, that in common with all other Western countries, even though we actually did better than most of them, there's this crisis of confidence in our leadership?
Yeah.
What's the problem there?
Well,
You've alluded to it.
Yeah.
How do you see it?
Well, look, I'm not an insider, but the way I can see it is we've had, the GFC was a world shock, and again, the dispossessed and those that are in the middle felt that they really suffered the most out of it, and the people that caused it didn't. So that has built up a world sensitivity to big business and their ethics and scruples. And perhaps some of the bad stuff coming out of the GFC, they're entitled to feel that. I mean, Australia was absolutely clean. I mean, our regulation system worked perfectly, our banks were secure, and even, the government moved quickly to make them even more secure. So we rode through the GFC with, in my view, flying colours. But that infected the world's attitude to big business and where it's going. So I think there's a problem there. But what's happened with Australia is we've had 26 years of unbroken growth, and I think it's bred a certain complacency. We are so heavily reliant on the commodity sector. We got through the GFC because of the massive investment in the resources sector. No other reason. Yeah, there was a bit of government work and a bit of pump priming, but it was the resources sector investment.
We had a public sector that had money in the bank too.
And you had a public sector.
Unlike most other Western countries.
You had money in the bank, you had reserves, you had capacity to borrow. Now, the problem was, though, that once that boom in investment stopped, or slowed down as it has now, we are relying again on the resources sector in terms of reasonably high commodity prices, but we're getting a better idea of what the modern economy may look like, and it ain't that great. You know, we are very over-regulated. Our productivity is low on world scale. For a country that's healthy, well-educated, with very strong, you know, and secure systems and a good legal system, we are very slow to move. We're very conservative. All of that innovation and stuff that drove us from colonisation 200 years ago has basically petered out. We've become, in my view, quite a boring sort of unambitious country. Our investment community, you know, focuses on the 3-monthly return, the quarterly return. You know, they don't seem to be taking a look at, you know, 10, 20, 30 or 40 years out. They're worried about next quarter. That short-termism seems to have plagued, again, investment in the business community. Our SMEs, you know, which are sort of huge employers and one of the drivers of our economy, are just, they're sort of almost dying under the burden of regulation. The 3 levels of government that seem to be in a competition to see how much burden they can put on them. They're dying under the burden of excessively high energy costs. We've gone from a low-cost country in terms of energy to one of the highest in the Western world.
Let's just put some numbers around that. I mean, I read the other day that at the time of the GFC, and before we started playing with renewable energy targets and all of the uncertainty that surrounded that, we had the cheapest electricity in the OECD. We're now roughly double America, double France's, and astonishingly more higher than Japan, that has no energy of its own.
And the community understands this wasn't a market failure, this was a government failure. This is imposed by government. You know, the market is what has been created, but it's a market that the private sector will participate in on the rules that are given. But it was a failure, a complete failure. It's the failure of government that's led us here, not the failure of markets. And unless government accepts this, that they have failed, they absolutely have failed. They've failed their community, they've failed the country, and they really have put us in a very difficult position in terms of world competitiveness.
I'd love to come back to that in a moment, but can we go to a particular area where you've been focused because you've done some work particularly for the coalition government around debt. Now, it's now 10 years effectively, a decade we've had since the GFC started. At those times, many Western nations had moderately concerning levels of debt to GDP, and for the layman, that's public sector debt as a proportion of the total value of goods and services produced in an economy every year. Generally speaking, I think people would say once it starts to get up that sort of 50 to 100%, that bracket, you start to slow growth, etc. Now, we went into the GFC with money in the bank.
Yes.
Money in the bank, almost alone, if not alone, amongst Western countries. Many others, they were plodding along a slightly worrying level. What actually happened then was that the massive debts that the corporate and private sector built up were taken onto government balance sheets, and their debt to GDP ratios absolutely soared. Our turnaround from having a surplus to almost peddling hard as though we want to catch up with all those countries in crisis has been quite worrying. And you've looked closely at this, the Intergenerational report, the National Commission of Audit you did for the National Commission of Audit that you did for the Abbott government. And so you're right across this stuff. It all sounds arcane to the person in the street, although Australians, they know a bit about their country. And when you talk to them in the streets, they say, we're really worried about governments losing control of their debts. Now, as I read it, in fact, although it's technically true to say our situation at this point isn't anything like the rest of the world, I reckon we're only 5 or 6 years away from losing control like the Americans and the Europeans did.
There's an old, Hemingway's great book, The Sun Always Rises, And the hero in that was asked how he went bankrupt, and he said, gradually at first and then in a rush.
Yeah.
And this is what happens to governments.
Yep.
So Ireland's going along just, wow, shooting the lights out. The GFC hits, the banking crisis wipes out their banking, they're bankrupt. The IMF has to come in and sort them out. It can just change on a dime. It can change so quickly. And this is the risk that Australia now faces. As you say, our debt in percentage of GDP is not bad. It's not too bad at all. But it is growing. The trajectory is wrong. It's growing faster than, I think, all but one country in the OECD. It is due to a structural deficit. It is a structural deficit. It's not like, oh, the government's decided we'll spend money here and spend there and then it'll stop next year. It's a structural deficit. The 15 largest programs are legislated. Yes. They're embedded.
They're entitlement driven.
And they're entitlement driven. They're embedded. There is nothing that you
Very
can
little
do.
discretionary expenditure for government.
It's the discretionary spend is about 70 billion out of 450. I mean, it's relatively small. And if you take defence out, it's very small. If you think the defence is not discretionary. So there's not much that a government can do short of getting legislation through the Senate, which is proving to be impossible. So this debt is inexorably increasing. So if you took the 2015 IGR and now they've taken off the ridiculous assumption that the expenditure will grow at 2% real of GDP, well, that's just proven to be absolute rubbish. Because of that embedded entitlement, then by 2055, the structural deficit will be 12.5% of GDP, and our debt to GDP ratio will be 126%. Now, whether the world will let us get to that level or not is another matter. I mean, already Standard & Poor's have blown the whistle and said, look, you're in good shape, but if the trajectory is wrong, it's making us a bit nervous, and the first sign of the real problem will be a AAA downgrade. But the other thing, the thing you've alluded to, the GFC hit, we were in great shape. Yep. And we had the reserves then to pull ourselves through. What if something else happens like a GFC again? Where are we going to go? I'll tell you that
the Hemingway rush.
The Hemingway rush will come. We could get into serious problems in a debt situation very, very quickly if growth, growth has slowed down now. It's below 3%. Inflation's very small. Real wages are not really growing. It won't take much for us to have a real turn down. We live in a volatile world. What's going to happen in North Asia? Our two biggest sources of export dollars are China and Japan. Yep. Where are they? North Asia. Yeah. We should be very scared about what's happening.
And focusing on it.
But
we're so inward looking
because, I mean, you turn off our exports or our exports diminished for a year or so, I mean, what would happen?
Certain of our imports as well, we have almost no liquid fuel reserves.
Exactly.
We'd run out in weeks. If something serious happened in the South China Seas. We don't even have a fuel reserve. But that's an aside. To come back to, because what we want to do here is drill into what does this mean? So we're not scaremongering because we've seen it happen. The greatest fool is the person who sees the evidence of what can go wrong if you ignore the warning signs. Yeah. Europe and America, with the loss of their budgetary controls. I mean, America's debt today is 20 trillion US. Yes. Their unfunded liabilities going forward are around 140 trillion. Yeah. That's more than the global economy for a year. Just one country.
It is.
Now, where this really comes to dwell, and what worries me most, is you and I have had great lives. We've been unbelievably fortunate in one sense.
We were born in a golden age in many respects.
Yeah. But we've got kids and grandkids. Paul Kelly, the editor-at-large of The Australian, was quite brilliant on this the other day when there's this argument going on, let's just spend more, it doesn't matter, we've got to have the good life now, we're not in debt. And it's really an argument about distribution. Nobody's talking about growing the pie. They're saying, I just want a bigger slice of the pie.
Well, we've lost all that argument about growing the pie. I mean, it seems to me everybody just wants a bigger slice. Nobody wants to do anything to make the pie bigger. And we need a bigger pie because the population is ageing.
The population's ageing.
And our productivity's down, and so we're going backwards, basically. As a country, we're going backwards.
But he made a brilliant point that I wish, every classroom could hear, and every parent and grandparent could hear. If we want the good life, we either pay for it as we go or we're engaging in intergenerational theft
We are.
and expecting our kids to play for our consumption now. And here's the rub, as you've just alluded to. Fewer children, because of the demographic cliff, this is going to really hit Europe. And it's going to hit a lot of Asia.
Yeah, well, it's hit Japan already.
So we build up these horrendous debts and we say our kids can pay for our living now,
And they're
but then we have fewer kids, so the
Yeah.
proportion of the debt we pass on to them per head is
Yes.
even worse. I actually think that's a big moral issue. Can I
It's
say that? I think it's a
massive.
moral issue.
It's a moral and ethical issue. Look, we have at the moment, say, 4.5 people for every person retired. 4.5 people working for every person retired. By 2050, we'll probably have 2.5 people working for everybody retired. So just to maintain our existing standard of living, that 2.5 has got to produce as much as the 4.5 are doing now.
That's staggering.
It's a staggering statistic.
It
And
is staggering.
and you know, look, and people say, oh well, you know, you're being too pessimistic. Something will happen and what have you. Well, something may happen, but what if
It's
it
hard to
doesn't?
see what it might be.
It's hard to see what it might be in a country that's over-regulated, you know, fairly high taxation, that sort of thing. It's hard to see what will be the game changer. We've been lucky in the past. You know, the resources boom was just, you know, really good. The gold rush back in the 50s was brilliant for a young colony starting out. So we've been lucky in the past. The wool boom and the wheat boom after the Second World War was, again, we were lucky. But I'm not sure what's going to make us lucky again. What's the next thing that's going to make this country lucky?
Now, Tony, you know, this has been a can-do country. We've done remarkably well on a whole set of economic and social fronts over a long period of time. We held together through, the Americans call it, I think, their greatest generation, the people who saw their country through the Great Depression and through World War II, through Korea, the Cold War, collapse of the Berlin Wall. And we have a very proud story to tell. We've got to honour our forebears and the things we say we believe in by tackling all of this. And that's where you've been at the forefront. You're almost a household name because the government asked you to have a close look at what was really happening and to come up with some recommendations. You came up with 48. Yeah. So there's a couple of points that come out of that. There are answers. Yeah. There are things we can and should be doing which can break the cycle of despair and pick things up for our kids. But can you give us a feel for your recommendations and what's happened to them?
Well, look, some of them were taken up and probably more than people would think. And even the reforms that we've had in social security in terms of making sure that people who are genuinely entitled get what they're entitled to and no more and no less, those sorts of reforms are all part of the detail of the report. But, you know, we've virtually cut corporate welfare to zero, business welfare to zero. That was quite a big change, and that has saved a lot of money. There's been changes in various, like veterans allowances and things like that. There's been reforms there. There's been some reform in superannuation. Some people might say it's gone a bit too far, but we also said, yeah, well, look, superannuation is a huge benefit to some people, but it doesn't seem to be working, attracting more people into being fully covered. You know, it's only about 20% of the people that would in their retirement that survive on their superannuation, and that percentage hasn't changed. But we also said there are things like the age pension entitlement, where we said, well, really, the family home above a particular level should go into the asset test. Why should somebody living in a $5 million home get a full age pension, and somebody who can't afford a home pay taxes at 37 cents on the dollar to help them do that? I mean, that it's inequitable. So there's those inequitable things, I think, that we really need to tackle very hard. And I think also the efficiency with, we did a lot of work on the efficiency with which government spends its money, and I still think it's weak. I just don't think there's enough attention paid to the efficacy of grants and investments in various programs. I think in the Indigenous space, I think a lot of money is still incredibly wasted, and the results are appalling still. I mean, on all of the KPIs, for example, in the Indigenous space in the last 10 years, I think 4 out of 5, they've gone backwards. despite this massive increased expenditure, because the programs are ill-conceived, they're overlapping, they're running at the state level, the federal level, the handoffs are complicated, and it's more about the process, not about the outcomes. So government's got to start really thinking seriously about what are the outcomes we want, what does the consumer want, what does the community want, rather than, we'll have this long, complicated, convoluted process which will waste a lot of money on the way through. So there's still a lot there to be done. Now on the reform side, I mean, the thing is that, we've got to get Australians back to that philosophy. If I can look after myself, I will. I won't expect the government to do it for me. Now that's a big step for a country that's always had that philosophy. To get off that has been, I think, one of the root causes of the problem.
How did it happen so quickly?
I don't know. I think it was just this because of this huge prosperity, that age of entitlement was built up, and the baby boomers worked very hard to give us the wealth we now enjoy, and they said, well, look, now we've finished, we want to be rewarded for that, for all the hard work we did over all those 50 or 60 years. So I think that's sort of contributed to it. But I think, the rise of social media, the way that the modern media works, has encouraged this sort of individualism and this sense of entitlement, which I think spreads from the top of the corporate structure to the poorest person in society. And we've lost focus on the fact that what we really want to do in terms of welfare is concentrate our efforts on those people who can't look after themselves for whatever reason, and that's where the effort should go. And not for 1 second should that be diminished in any way. And in fact, the problem we've got now is we're going up the scale in terms of providing support, and it's taking money away, from my view, from those that actually really need it.
Let's then come back to one of the areas where we really are shooting ourselves in the foot: energy costs. Yeah. See, it doesn't matter what you do in this country, we're an energy-intensive economy. I'm a farmer. Up to a third of a farmer's costs can be transport and energy related. It's a staggering figure, but we just seem to be able to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory at every turn on this one. If I just put a proposition to you, my clear understanding is that in 10 years we've gone from having electricity prices the cheapest in the world to double the price of America's and double of France's, and yet both of those countries have had better environmental outcomes. Yeah. We've actually made a mess of it on both fronts. Yeah. We've not only not got the results we should have environmentally, we've crippled our economy. I had a staggering thing the other day in the meat industry that some new technology has been developed which reduces processing costs or increases yields to an extent of about 30%. A massive saving, massive saving. Yeah. 45 cents in every dollar saved in processing goes back to farmers, obliterated by increased energy costs. Yeah. Obliterated. So not only does the consumer pay more and the farmer gets less, we put our export markets at risk.
Yes, we do. We're killing ourselves.
But how did it happen? And what should we do?
Well, it's the East Coast market. Well, firstly, we had states going on their own, introducing RET schemes, which weren't part of a national organised or an East Coast organised market. And so we had overlapping rules and regulations and subsidies going on, which I think added quite considerably. We had gold plating of the transmission system in New South Wales, which added considerably and was sort of a trigger for that. And basically, because of the subsidies into the renewable energy, the baseload coal and gas, where we were very efficient, couldn't actually compete on a price basis against them.
Once the cost of the installation of the alternatives had been provided by the taxpayer.
By the taxpayer. Yeah. Or the consumer, actually. Yeah. By the consumer, that added to the cost. Yeah. So when you subsidise a wind farm, the taxpayer doesn't pay for it. The energy consumer pays for it. So that adds to your price. Yeah. Okay, then. So we've got the classic example in South Australia. Now here's a wonderful example. They have an energy crisis because the transmission line, the big, long, thin piece of spaghetti breaks down under heavy wind load. These things happen. They've got 200 megawatts of gas-fired power parked that can't be turned on during that crisis. Why was it parked? It was parked because the owner of it couldn't make a buck out of it because they couldn't compete with wind day to day. So it wasn't worth keeping it going, it wasn't worth having a long-term gas contract in place. So what's the answer? The South Australian government says, oh, well, we'll buy a whole lot of batteries, which will last them about an hour. It will take about 3 years of the world's total lithium production to make them. That's another issue.
Is that right?
Yeah. And we'll build our own gas-fired power station. Well, then who pays for that new capacity? You've got existing capacity. Wouldn't you go to them and say, now, how much would it cost to keep you guys on ready alert? So it's a failure of government. The market was set on the sent-out price, and everybody thought that was fine when we had 85% base, 15 renewables. Well, now the percentages have changed dramatically. That doesn't work anymore, so there's no incentive to keep your base. So rather than thinking about Snowy Mountains 2, the government should be going to the market and paying for capacity. And this is what they're doing in other countries. We're not, again, on our own. This is what they're doing in the UK, they're doing in Italy, what have you.
Germany.
They're worried about capacity and they've created a market for capacity. Now, the poor old consumer shouldn't have to pay for that. It was the fault of government that we're here, and it's government will have to pay for that.
But that does mean taxpayers.
That means the taxpayers, at least the burden will be spread throughout the community. But given electricity, its importance to the whole of society, I think that's fair.
Socially and for jobs and industry.
Right, and socially.
And everything in between.
Yeah, I think government's made the mistake and government should pay for it. Not the market, not the consumer. The poor old consumer's paid enough already, thank you very much. Business, small, medium and large, has paid enough, thank you very much. Government's made the mistake, government pays. Now, I know it's the taxpayer, but at least the burden is spread evenly throughout society.
But you're saying something else. You're saying there is a solution.
The solutions are there. They're quite simple. I mean, sometimes they're a little bit tough, but the solutions are there. And it's just stop the obfuscation, stop making it so complicated that nobody can really understand what you're talking about. The solutions are actually there. You know, where the universities, they're producing far too many graduates that aren't qualified. We've just got to put a cap on the number of people that can go to university, and we should do it on merit. We can't have everybody in Australia with an arts degree. I mean, for what benefit economically is that? And what good is it for the kids if they can't get a job and they've got to go work in a supermarket or something? We're not producing the people we need for the modern era because of our training systems are appalling. So what do we, I mean, well, we've got the states doing it, we've got the feds doing it. Who's in charge? I don't know. Health's a mess. Who's in charge? They've got 3,000 people in health in Canberra. What are they doing? How many hospitals they run? And none. I mean, it's just, you know, we've got this, the federation really needs a fix, but again, it could be done simply. It's called devolution. Let's you know, feds, you write the checks, states, you do the delivery. That's the rule, and get out of each other's space.
All right, well, let's try and pull this together a little bit. The way I see it, we're all in this together. So you've got the political and public service class, you've got the voters in the community, and you've got the media. The media plays a critical role, and I know it's changing, and the whole face and practice and business of people getting their news and their information is changing, but they're the lubricators. You know, we rely on them, the media, one way or another, to tell us what's happening and to make sure we're able to communicate.
And more or less, they keep people more or less honest. Yeah.
Now, but all three, I think, need to sort of start to say, we need to think as Australians.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I have, you know, it's easy to say what the politicians are doing wrong. It's easy to criticise the media, but somehow or other we've got to get the electorate to the point where they say, we've been gridlocking the system in the Senate because we don't trust them.
Yeah.
And we're worried about what they'll do. And you said transactional. People have become transactional. So when they don't sort of trust the process anymore and they're wary about politicians, they say, we'll make sure in the Senate they can't do anything too draconian. I think that might be the thinking behind it.
Yeah.
But what do? We've got to break that gridlock. We have to be governable again.
It has been done. It has been done before. It's been done. It's done across the Tasman, in a little country called New Zealand.
Well, one house.
Yeah, one House of Parliament, but they've brought the community with them.
Are you suggesting we should do away with the Senate?
Absolutely. Waste of time and money. Waste of time and money. I think the average Australian probably agree with me in the end too. Just a complete waste of time and money, the upper house. And, I don't think it serves no useful purpose really.
Well, it does serve a purpose now. It
Yeah, it
appears to
does.
be able to block
everything.
the government. We used to talk about mandates. They must be worth something. I mean, if people actually vote a government in,
I know.
they must, on balance, prefer its approaches.
Yeah.
But then the Senate's not letting. We're gridlocking it.
We're gridlocking it. But the New Zealand government has brought the people with them. They haven't been that draconian. They've reformed the budget slowly and fairly. And they're back into surplus, by the way, long before us. They've brought the people with them. They've grown the economy. They're now the biggest exporter of dairy products in the world.
And incredible, really, isn't it?
But they've been fair about it, more equitable, perhaps is a better word. And so they've been able to do these reforms, get economic growth, be equitable, and bring the community with them. And they're not in the media every day. I mean, I think John Key used to do one media a week after Cabinet on Monday. He'd sit down and talk to the reporters about what Cabinet discussed and decided to do today in a sort of a really open sort of way. It builds a lot of trust with the community. Well, we know what they're doing down there in Wellington. Now, okay, this is what they're up to. This bloke sounds reasonable and sensible. And he delivers what he said he's going to deliver, and the outcomes seem to be working for us. New South Wales, a little bit closer to home. I mean, they've gone through a huge reform agenda starting under O'Farrell, privatise or semi-privatise the power sector, 170% support, have got the biggest infrastructure program the country has ever seen, which has had a massive impact on our economy into the positive. Now, all right, there's a couple of things that people don't like, and perhaps they could have handled those a lot better, but generally speaking, they've brought the community with them. So you can reform and bring the community with you, but you've got to be open about it. You've got to explain over and over again what and why you're doing it. So Baird, I thought, with the selling off 49% of the power system, he was relentless in explaining it, and he was relentless in explaining what the money was going to be used for. And the people said, well, that's good. Yeah, look, I'm not mad about you doing this. I don't like privatisation. Most Australians don't. But I can see that this is going to be a positive benefit for us. And so I think you can do it. I think you still can do it. But it takes, you have to have that change, and you have to recognise that 50% of Australians now get their news off the net, not through TV, not through newspapers and what have you. So you've also got to use all of the modern means of communication to bring the people with you. And you've got to genuinely listen to them. When they start complaining about affordable housing or electricity costs, don't give them a 600-page report. Do something. And do something real that actually does work. Don't say, oh yeah, but in 10 years' time everything's going to be fine. No, my problem is today. What are you doing for me tomorrow? The Australians are great people. And as I said, they're healthy, they're well educated, they're very fair, they're egalitarian. They don't mind helping people who are less well off than themselves. The mateship binds us together as a country. So I think you can bring them with you, but you've also got to listen to them, and you've got to look after them properly.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks.